I never knew my father. I understood he was killed in the Second World War, around the time of my birth in 1944. My mother never said very much about him or how he died. I imagine it must have been too painful for her to talk about it. And as a child I instinctively knew, as children do, this was a subject on which I should not press her for details. It was clear, however, that she'd not forgotten him. She continued to wear her cheap wedding band, and in addition I never had any indication that she had any interest in remarrying. Although, even to my childish eyes, she seemed to be at least an adequately good-looking woman. To all intents and purposes, I had no family apart from my mother. Both my mother's people and my late father's parents lived in Toronto. They had little to do even with my maternal grandparents, whom I remember as aloof and faintly disapproving of both me and my mother. We visited them a couple of times at Christmas, but somehow the atmosphere seemed rather strained even to my untutored eye, and I don't recall them ever visiting us. My aunts and uncles would also gather at my grandparents' homes at Christmas time. We weren't close to them either. It was, moreover, a considerable journey to get there. The train ride from Guelph to Union Station, and then streetcar out to Long Branch took up much of the day. As for my father's family, I have no recollection of ever having met them. In the earliest years, as I can remember, we lived in one of what were called wartime houses, after the name of the Crown Corporation that was responsible for having erected them. In the garden there was a small apple tree which was just old enough to bear a little fruit each fall. My mother kept a vegetable garden to supplement in season the produce from the local groceteria, which predated modern supermarkets. Mother was a stenographer at a manufacturing company that made refrigerators for the domestic market. I remember her telling me that the models I saw depicted in the Eaton's catalogue were manufactured right here in town. Not that we were sufficiently affluent to own one, of course. I was 7 or 8 years old when we left the house on Lemon Street and moved into an upstairs apartment in a walk-up building. At that age I naturally had no idea of my small family's finances, and so I was unaware that we had rented the house on Lemon Street, or that the money had become so tight that we could no longer afford it. The move necessitated a change of school, and so I lost contact with my former schoolmates and the minimal friendships that I had made. By this I mean that I had a lonely existence. Therefore, as a child, I read voraciously books from the public library and excelled at my schoolwork. In due course, I graduated from public school and attended the local collegiate and vocational institute. There I did acquire a circle of friends, mostly studious and shy like myself, who today would be called nerds. Upon graduation from high school, I was fortunate to obtain an entry-level position as a trainee manager, the local branch of the Bank of Montreal. My contribution made a significant difference to the family income, and visits to the cinema and bowling alley, for example, changed from being rare treats into more routine activities. I was in my 20s and still living at home when my mother died suddenly. She'd cut herself on some rusty metal while trying to make a garden out of the patch of near wasteland out behind the apartment building. The cut became infected, septicemia set in. By the time she went to the hospital, it was too late to save her. We must remember that this was well before OSIP came along, and our insurance coverage was pretty basic. The funeral was held at the local Presbyterian church that we attended irregularly. It was small and subdued. The mourners include only a few friends, colleagues of mine and of mother's, and some church ladies. My grandmother made the effort to come from Toronto, and she arrived the evening before the funeral and stayed the minimum time that was decent before returning to Toronto on an afternoon train. The minister made a minimal attempt to offer comfort to those present, that the departed, whose name he mispronounced as Margaret rather than Marguerite, was now in a better place. With the death of my mother, I had to decide whether or not to retain the apartment. Either way, I had the mournful task of disposing of my mother's effects. I took her clothes to the Goodwill store. She had essentially no jewellery, just the wedding band that was buried with her, an opal brooch and a set of earrings, both of which I kept as a memento. I closed her bank account and collected together her employment pay stubs in order to prepare for her final tax return at the end of the year. At the very back of the clothes closet I found a shoebox, tied with coloured twine. It was clearly some kind of a keepsake, and I was therefore somewhat reluctant to open it. Even in death it seemed rather an intrusion into my mother's private affairs. When I did so, I found the box was full of letters. From end to end they comprised, in chronological order, a collection of loose letters, a large group that was tied with faded blue ribbon, and a single envelope whose return address showed the imprint of the legal firm Maxwell and Ryder of Toronto. I began with the latter, which to my surprise was addressed to Miss Marguerite Stewart. Dated October 24th, 1952, it read as follows. Dear Miss Stewart, I'm writing to inform you that following the recent death of my son Arthur, there will be no further monthly remittance to you to assist with raising your son. Our family has been very generous with regard to my son's indiscretion, and at this time his widow and 3 children have the greater claim on his estate. Yours faithfully, signed, Harold J. Maxwell, Senior Partner, Maxwell and Ryder. I was astonished. The letter, despite its brevity, raised some questions and answered others. Miss Stewart indicated that my parents had never been married, that I was the result of some kind of liaison between my mother and this Arthur Maxwell. This implied that my mother's wedding ring was a flag of convenience. No wonder we'd never had any interaction with my father's people, and in those straight-laced times, it was hardly surprising that both my mother and I were objects of disapproval by her own family. She for having brought shame on them, and I as a constant reminder of that calumny. As to the date of the letter in the fall of 1952, when I was 8 years old, that was when we moved from the house on Lemon Street. I assumed that the rent had now become unaffordable. I wondered how my mother and Arthur had met. She clearly loved him dearly rather than despised him, having given me his Christian name, and also having made no effort to find another partner, even after his death. Knowing that she'd been a stenographer, I imagined that perhaps she'd been employed in that capacity in the firm of Maxwell and Ryder, and so it proved to be. I discovered this as I moved my attention to the other letters in the box. Those tied up with blue ribbon had presumably been returned in a package with a letter from Harold Maxwell. Whether they'd been tied up by my father or by my mother was and is unknown. They were all written in my mother's hand and addressed to Arthur Maxwell, care of Maxwell and Ryder, King Street, Toronto, and marked personal, to be opened only by the addressee. Putting them in chronological order, the earliest ones, dated from 1944, preceded my birth. They included protestations of love and longing to be together as she prepared for her confinement. Later, these avowals became more muted, and eventually they ceased, both as reality set in that being together would never be an option. That became apparent from the much smaller collection of letters in the box from Arthur himself. These began with expressions of youthful hope and longing, but developed a cooler quality with time, especially after the letter of June the 4th, 1947, which announced Arthur's engagement. Letters from 1944 to 1952 were approximately quarterly accounts of my development in the first 8 years of my life, such as my first words, first steps, first day at school, and along with references to enclosed photographs of some of these events. Although the endearments became less effusive as time went on, it was clear that Mother never held any animosity towards the man who had fathered her child. And moreover, the fact that the photographs had been removed from the letters suggested my father had not been indifferent to this correspondence. Maybe he even retained a degree of kindly inclination towards my mother. From the early correspondence I surmised that Mother had been Arthur Maxwell's secretary. Clearly found her extremely attractive, slim and bright-eyed. In those more restrained and perhaps even refined times, the letter did not dwell on the physical aspects of their affair. Besides, these events had may have occurred before separation made it necessary to correspond. When Mother became pregnant, it was of course standard practice that she must resign her position as stenographer, and although she was, quote, sent away by Arthur, it's clear that he intended to treat her decently and honourably, at least by the standards of the time. So now, I told myself, you're illegitimate, a bastard according to the mores of the 1940s and 50s. My father was not a serviceman who was killed in the war, but a junior partner in a prestigious Toronto law firm, who knocked up my mother and arranged for her to be sent away to a small town 70 miles away. My history changed at a stroke, and yet it didn't, while at the same time it also did. By the time I met Linda, my mind had settled on a somewhat blended account of my ancestry. It wasn't really dishonest, for I'd always imagined myself as the son of a World War II hero. The tapestry of my life simply gained some new and brighter threads, and the narrative became the following. My father, Arthur Stewart, had volunteered for duty in 1943. A hasty marriage to his sweetheart Marguerite and a brief honeymoon at Niagara Falls led to my conception. Right away, my father joined his regiment and went overseas. He died in the D-Day landing shortly after my birth, and in his memory, my grief-stricken mother named me Arthur. Mother never forgot her sweetheart. She wore the modest wedding ring he gave her until her dying day. Sadly, I never knew my father's parents. However, we were close to my maternal grandparents, and we visited back and forth to Toronto as often as possible while they were alive. As a veteran's widow, Mother qualified for a wartime home, but we later moved closer to the town centre so that I could continue my education at the local high school. In order to raise me, Mother worked hard all her life as a stenographer at a factory that made refrigerators, and it is to her that I owe any modest success that I've had so far in my life. I became engaged to Linda 2 years ago, but before we married I burned the box of letters.